Hello, welcome everyone, and welcome to the launch of the special issue of the Human Rights Defender magazine on climate justice. An incredibly important issue at the moment. The Human Rights Defender is a human rights magazine published by the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW Sydney. The magazine is proudly produced by guest editors across different disciplines, working with student editors, and has been covering developments in human rights since 1992. To launch this issue, we have gathered together some of the magazine's contributors to discuss Australia's climate policy as we emerge from COVID-19 lockdown, the looming bushfire season, and what climate justice means for people from low-lying islands. My name is Craig Reucassel. I'll be your host for today, host of Fight for Planet A and Big Weather. And we've got some fantastic guests. We've got Zali Steggall, the independent member of Parliament, who is pushing for a binding Australian target on emissions. Greg Mullins, former New South Wales Fire Chief and global expert on bushfires, who advocates for climate action. Yessie Mosby, the Torres Strait Islander, who has taken a complaint about Australia's lack of action on climate issues to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, a fascinating case there. And Andy Symington, the PhD candidate at UNSW and the guest editor, who argues that we all have power to make progress on the issue of climate justice. And Andy, I'll start with you as the guest editor of this Human Rights Defender magazine. What was your motivation for putting together this issue?
Thanks, Craig, and thanks, Greg, Zali and Yessie for being here today. I'd also just briefly like to say thank you to all the contributors to this issue who are so generous with their time and expertise. And also just to mention that Human Rights Defender is a very totally collaborative publication, and so I owe a lot of thanks to my friends and colleagues in the Australian Human Rights Institute who've helped put this together. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging. I think it's particularly apposite that because when we speak of climate change, it affects everyone, but we have to acknowledge it's a monstrous injustice to Indigenous people across the globe that's being visited on them. Something they've least contributed to in general, to the causes, and have most to lose from the effects. So I'm very happy that we've got so many Indigenous contributors to this issue. So it was about a year ago, about last December, a bit less than a year, in the middle of the bushfire season. I was attending an event in the centre of Sydney. There was the sun was a red smudge in the sky. The city was choked with smoke. It was about 45 degrees. It felt like it anyway. And people were wandering around with this look of dread on their faces. Right? They had this haunted look. They looked totally overwhelmed. And just to contrast, a few weeks earlier, I'd been in Chile, where there'd been still is this massive social explosion, and the groups from all over the country, different groups who wouldn't normally have much in common, had got together, taken to the streets because they were fed up. They were fed up of injustice. They were fed up of inequality. They were fed up of being voiceless in their own democracy. And I looked around Santiago and I thought, wow, there's a lot of anger here. And there's also a lot of hope that they can change things. And so that's one of the key aims of this issue, because I think to defend human rights and to fight for climate justice, we need both of those things. We need anger and we need hope. And so the first aim of the issue is to make us bloody angry. Angry that countries are in flames, forests are burning. Angry that countries, homelands are in danger of disappearing under the waves. Angry that human rights are endangered across the planet, and that the whole human rights system may be in jeopardy. And so climate scientists say to us, well, there's still a window of opportunity here. It's a small window and it's closing quickly. And so we have to act, and we have to act now. But what action do we take? It can seem overwhelming, the whole scale of it, right? And so even small things like you go down to the shop, you want to buy a new shirt. Okay, well, what'll I pick? Cotton uses a lot of water, too much water, drains ecosystems, leaves villages without drinking water. Polyester, well, it's a fossil fuel. And that's before you even get on to how it was produced. You know, what labour conditions, was there modern slavery involved? Was there child labour involved? And so we're just not equipped to make these choices. And so what I feel people tend to do is that we retreat into our own sort of bubble in a way. We say, well, you know, I can't change what's happening, so I'm going to make sure that my own little corner of the world is sustainable. You know, I'll compost my food waste, I'll go vegan, I'll put a solar panel on the roof. And these are all brilliant choices. They're excellent choices. And I think they're choices that we need to make to ensure a sort of long-term sustainable way of life on this planet. But they're not effective choices for the pressing problem, which is the danger of overwhelming, irreversible climate change. If Yessie or another Torres Strait Islander or Marshall Islander comes to you and says, well, look, you know, my homeland's in danger here, what are you doing about it? And if you say, well, I'm minimising my own carbon footprint, well, that's great, but it's not good enough. It's not effective. We need some form of more effective change, systemic change. And so I guess the principal actors who can achieve systemic change are governments and corporations. So I feel that we need to be focusing on them. This can seem difficult, but I think there is hope, and that's the second aim of this issue, to show that there's hope. There's no single solution, I think, but there's a lot of different levers that you can lever governments, lever corporations, and it may not seem like much, these kind of incremental changes, but just as climate scientists warn about tipping points where suddenly small changes become this kind of massive, irreversible change, I think there are political tipping points as well. And so, you know, these incremental changes can suddenly become a kind of avalanche where a lot can change at once. And so we complain about governments and corporations being self-interested, but we can work on that. We can work with that. So, for example, if the current Australian government believed that they were going to lose the next election if they didn't have a robust climate policy in place, you can bet they'll be working on it straight away. The same with corporations. They run on risk, and so if a corporation sees that there's going to be risk to the business if they don't improve their climate performance, then they'll do that. Super funds, for example, another lever. You know, there's massive. A lot of Australians have super. We've got these massive funds. By putting pressure on these funds, they can put pressure on companies to improve their performance. And so this second sort of theme of the issue is the contributors who are writing about various of these levers, whether that's youth activism, whether that's legislation, in Zali's case, law reform, strategic litigation, or shareholder action. So the issue is very much a call to action. It's a call to effective action. Don't be overwhelmed. We're saying focus on finding one particular area where maybe you can be effective. Find a lever and pull on it, push on it as hard as you can.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing. As you say, people can get very overwhelmed by it. It's interesting. I think you're right that the great injustice of climate change is that the people that have generally contributed the least to it are the ones that get affected the most by it. Do you think that Australians are concerned about overseas effects of climate change, or do you think they're very parochial when it comes to that?
I feel that's a problem here. I think we are quite insular, and that's something that I think the bushfire season, in a way, maybe it made us realise, well, hang on, this is, you know, we can't just ride this one out. We are part of this. We are seeing effects already. So I think that is changing, hopefully, but it's certainly, yeah, I take the point that it can be difficult to gain traction on overseas climate effects here.
One of the things as well, it's interesting hearing you talk about the fact that politicians need to see a risk in not responding to climate action, is there's a kind of popular narrative that the last election was a rebuff of that. Although I think the election of Zali and certain other shifts in certain seats actually probably suggest the opposite of that. But how do you think we change that? How do we communicate what are the issues that are important at election time when it tends to get caught up in so many other issues? I mean, in a sense, your vote in election time is very hard to understand what its particular issue is aimed at. How do you think we best communicate that to keep that pressure on politicians and make it so that risk is an issue?
I think there's the problem here that the climate debate's become kind of polarised, and I think there's the things that can be done from this side. That I think the kind of climate politics can adopt maybe a less hectoring tone at times, and this kind of notion of individual responsibility, which is important, but it's the key issues are. They should be important to business and governments, and so if we can kind of move it into a more common space, let's talk about these things in the centre ground. I think the bushfire season again will have changed some attitudes on that. It's no longer something we can ignore here. But I mean, it's a problem of Australian politics, I guess, that everything seems to be so politicised the whole time. Difficult to know how to change that, maybe.
That seems like a perfect time to segue to our next guest, Zali Steggall, who entered Australia's federal parliament as an independent member for parliament and has promised to pressure the government to act on climate change. You plan to introduce your climate change bill to parliament in November, and you write about it in the magazine. Now, why this bill, and what do you think it will achieve?
Yeah, well, look, first, could I just echo the sentiments in terms of paying my respects to the traditional owners. I'm here in Canberra, but also for everyone wherever they are. I think there's a huge role in all of us in actually learning from the past, learning from traditional owners in how can we do it better. And I think maybe this is the right aspect about this whole issue around climate change and how Australia has become so polarised on it and so paralysed because of that. There have been mistakes made. There's no doubt about that. And we're in this political class in Australia where there seems to be this sort of attacking mentality that no one can ever pivot from a policy or a mistake into actually progress. You can acknowledge that maybe there wasn't a case, there might have been a scientific case for action, but there wasn't a wide consensus of public will for change previously. I think that is where we've progressed. So there's no doubt that the summer we've had record high temperatures. The bushfires saw our first climate refugees on our shore, people being evacuated from beaches, people dying from respiratory illnesses. We've had a huge impact economically, whole communities shut down, devastated. And as you say, from a social injustice point of view, it is often the poorer socioeconomic communities that are impacted the most. We certainly saw that with bushfires as well. And the impacts are so far reaching. So I think we have come to a bit of a, there is will in Australia. There's acknowledgement that this is an issue. Every survey comes back saying 80% or so of Australian people want better policy on climate change. So there's clearly now that overwhelming majority that wants change. I would argue the difficulty is it's been so polarising because it's been, unless it's perfect, it's not good enough and you're not really on board. And I think we need to start being a bit more collaborative in our approach. And that was probably where one of the things that motivated me to change careers from being a barrister to actually enter politics, to try and put forward some solutions. As a family law barrister, I had to do a lot of mediations of people that were very categoric about their position and they were very opposed. And you have to find some middle ground. You have to find, what do you agree on? What are the risks and the things that matter to everyone? And I think that's where our climate debate in Australia has been it's been weaponised. Sadly, probably the previous member for Warringah was a big contributor to that. Our media landscape contributed to that as well. And also, we have to be realistic that people's priorities, your immediate priority of needing your job and to meet your bills and your current situation will generally prevail over your concerns for what will happen in 10 or 15 years' time. So we have to acknowledge that and work with those concerns within communities. So I guess now, having entered the fray with politics, for me, my primary goal, especially as an independent, was not to enter into the sort of the slanging match of debate of left or right politics, but actually try and put forward the sensible kind of centre option, not be prescriptive on technology, but put in place the framework. So, and you only have to look around the world to see where it's worked, in what countries actually what's been the right approach. Australia, over 10 years ago, took the approach of being prescriptive with a mechanism, but didn't lock in the long-term goal. Other countries went around it the other way. They locked in the long-term goal, and then they've gradually worked on the how. So I looked at the UK model. They passed a climate change bill back in 2008, and it started from a Friends of the Earth campaign. It was a private member's bill. It had bipartisan support, and it survived 10 years of Brexit, UK politics. So clearly it's a framework that works. So climate change bill is actually quite simple. It's got 4 key features. It's locking into law our commitment to net zero by 2050. Now, I know, again, many advocates will say we need to get there sooner. I don't disagree with that, but we do need to put our line in the sand as to where is our outward reach. We can't have that as a no goal. So we have to lock that in, and we had to kind of ensure against changes of government, party room politics, by locking it into law so that it can't be changed. You can't have different people try and change the direction. It's what the private sector just desperately wants, is that policy certainty over the long term, so everyone can make decisions that will work and build towards that goal. As an athlete, I always make the comparison of, if you've got a goal to run a marathon, you've actually got to set the goal that's what you're aiming for. You're aiming for that 42 Ks, and then you've got to work your way backwards and set a training program in place. And it might be that for the first month you're running 1 or 2 Ks, and you're gradually building it up until incrementally you will get to that goal. And that's what the climate change bill does. It sets that goal of net zero, and then we have 5-year emission reduction budget periods in which we gradually increase our capacity. Now, I wish we could say that everyone's ready to sprint to the finish line, but I think realistically we're not there. Communities, business sectors, it all needs to adapt and adjust to that. So the key is providing that framework to bring everyone along. And I do feel like with many technology changes we've had, the rate of take up and disruption accelerates. So the more we get sectors of the Australian economy into lower emission technologies, into setting those goals and achieving those goals, the bigger the next goal gets and the next goal. So those 5-year emission reduction budgets will incrementally get us there and deliver those results we need. A big part as well of the bill is we have to address our risk assessment, the adaptation and resilience of our sectors. Now, Greg, I'm sure will talk a lot about that, and from a climate justice point of view, so many of our communities are really at risk, and I think we've never been more aware of that than this year, in terms of, and it's not just, are you, seawater rising, which has always been sort of the area that everyone sort of zeroed in on, but you've got droughts, you've got rising temperatures, you've got increasing unprecedented big weather events. Craig, you're doing a great series on that. I've met with the insurance companies, and they talk about having whole segments of the Australian coastline, the east coast, which is the most populated of Australia, that won't be insurable as a result of high risk of hurricanes and hailstorms and things like that. So these are things that will impact people in their day-to-day life, and more so poorer socioeconomic communities. And it's just something that doesn't enter the discussion. So we have to have legislated a risk assessment process, and a process by which the government has to respond and create adaptation plans, resilience. We need to build resilience. We know that there are risks that are locked in that we won't be able to turn around in the short to medium time. So we have to make sure our communities are better protected. We just can't have situations like last summer where communities are cut off by bushfires, have no power, have no communications, they have no real backup plan. Or our Pacific neighbours are really facing now increasing sea levels impacting their livelihoods and in so many aspects, you know, the risks are now. So we have to address that adaptation planning. And then I would hope that through this COVID year, we've had that exposure to the importance of independent expert advice. So I'm always, you know, when the climate comes up and people sort of talk about whether you believe in climate change or not, I think, well, hang on a minute. We're not talking about a religion here. This is fact. This is science. This is not about a belief. And as we've had through COVID, the Prime Minister stepping up with the Chief Medical Officer talking about the scientific facts that underpin the policies and the measures the government took, that is the conversation we need to have around climate impacts and why policy issues need to follow. Another example would be we don't debate the need to have a defence force. You know, we acknowledge that as a nation you have to be able to defend your borders and you have to protect your sovereignty. Now, I don't understand how we can't, you know, we have to apply that same thinking to our biggest, ironically, security risk, which is climate impacts. So we need to get to fact-based policy, and so an independent climate change commission with independent experts is very important. But the parts that I think really relate to the issue here in terms of climate justice is the bill goes into detail around guiding principles. So these decision-making bodies are really looking at generational equity. So we know gradual change in emission reduction will be done the most fiscally responsible way, and we provide generational equity. We can't all leave it to generations of the future. We need to, yep.
Sorry, Zali, can I just ask you, because it's interesting you talk about the partisan and the polarised nature of debate in Australia. I'm wondering if you think it's changed at all, given you've seen at state levels a lot of states committing to being net zero. You've seen, I guess, Liberal politicians, Steve Marshall or Matt Keane, kind of having a different dialogue that's kind of accepting climate change and trying to solve that problem. Has that changed the debate at all? Why, having now gone to federal politics and gone to federal parliament, why do you think the federal level is so different? And has there been any response from the major parties as to whether or not they'll support the climate change bill that you've put forward?
Look, yes. So has there been change? I believe there has. I mean, what we've seen has been an outstanding step up from all our states and territories are committed to net zero by 2050, and that's both Labor and coalition states. So clearly this is not an ideology problem. I think at state level, coalition is very different to federal level though. At federal level, there is a much stronger influence, for example, from the Minerals Council, and I would say individual sort of from a donations point of view to the major parties, and I think that has influenced policy. There is a sense from at national level of playing one area off another. So again, that idea of regional equity and how we're going to adjust to this. So areas in Queensland where there is current employment around fossil fuels, they will look at this as a real threat to their livelihoods. And so it's very polarising. What that approach ignores is this is a risk whether you like it or not, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. And so there is an opportunity to have a transition plan, or the rest of the world will dictate that disruption and it will come nonetheless, but you won't be prepared. So I think that is slowly coming. Again, politically, you'll never get 100% of everybody to agree on every issue, but we do have an overwhelming majority. What you do see is the pressure has to come from people. At the end of the day, my experience so far as an MP is the major driver for MPs in this place is re-election. They care about their job. And and it has to become an issue that people are not prepared to negotiate on. It has to be a vote driver, but then there has to be a clear alternative. And I think the difficulty at elections is that there's a number of issues that people are weighing up, and there's and you have to have an alternative to vote for. And so ironically, I have a lot of people reaching out who are saying, well, we want more independence, because at least that way you have a regional, you're focused on your local area in delivering what is going to work for that area. So in terms of the reception of the bill, it's a very different thing what people will say privately to what they will do publicly. And clearly pressure needs to come to bear from the Australian people. I'm only one independent from one seat, but we've got a campaign through climateactnow.com.au to write to your MP to put pressure on all areas of Australia. We've got support from the business community, insurers, big employers. So it really is, it has to be all sectors of the Australian society community calling for better policy.
Absolutely, I think that's right. Thank you, Zali. Well, good luck with the bill, and those who want to find out more details about it, of course, Zali writes about it in the Human Rights Defender magazine in this issue. Moving on to one of the other authors, Greg Mullins. Greg writes about the fire chiefs and the fact that they were warning the Australian government about the unprecedented fire season that was coming ahead. Hot Tip, he also talks to me about that tonight on Big Weather, actually. But I'm sure he goes into a lot more detail in this in this article here. Greg, you've been talking about this for a while. Do you think governments are now paying more attention?
Look, Craig, I do, and exactly as Zali said, politicians worry about keeping their job. And I think after this summer, people were shocked, extremely shocked. And look, the facts speak for themselves. People saw things, and one section of the media in particular tried to do a lot of spin to say we've always had fires in Australia, this is nothing different. But historically, they're totally incorrect. You're not comparing like with like. In human occupation, there's never been fires like this going back through the carbon record. 11 times more homes lost in New South Wales than our worst previous year, which was just back in 2013. So I won't go into detail about how it's worse, but former fire chiefs from every state and territory got together. We tried to warn the Prime Minister and federal government back in April last year. We were fobbed off until December, basically not listened to. But look, since then, independent inquiry reports from South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales, Queensland, short report in the ACT, a Senate inquiry that's just handed down its findings, preliminary findings of the Royal Commission, all chapter and verse, just say, as Zali said, it's fact. These fires could not have happened without the influence of climate change. And as a firefighter for 49 years, nearly 50, and I was fighting with these fires as a volunteer throughout the state all summer, I've never seen anything like it. California, Oregon, Colorado, Washington State, Idaho, they're all burning at the moment. Another bad day today. Unprecedented. Nearly 3 times as much area burnt as their previous worst year. So governments have to listen. Now, we need to put that pressure on. We need to elect Zali as President of the Australian Republic. But failing that, everything that people can do, as Andy said, I've got my solar panels and my next car's an electric car, et cetera, but it's the big policies. It's the manufacturing sector, it's transport, it's agriculture. We need policy settings, and the federal government is adrift. It doesn't have a goal or like the states and territories, they haven't committed to net zero emissions. And as Anthony Albanese said, it's a roadmap to nowhere. I know in business planning, when I was running the fire and rescue service for 14 years, you started with your strategy, your outcome. What outcome do you want? What's the goal? Then your strategies, then your tactics. You work out how to get there after you've set the stretch goal. But our government's not doing that. A lot of words. Through summer, the government changed their rhetoric from Anyone who says climate change has anything to do with bushfires is a raving inner city lunatic. To look, it's a factor. To yes, it's the driving factor, but that hasn't been matched by action at the national level, and we have to push for that.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think it's interesting because, as you say, there was an amazing momentum after that fire season. Do you think that COVID has gotten in the way of that momentum, or do you think now that we're also seeing fires starting up overseas, it's reminded us of that season that we saw? I mean, despite the fact that Donald Trump says it'll get cooler, he promises us. Do you think that people are again reliving that fire season again and having that similar concern?
Look, a lot of people I've spoken to have asked me about California. I was there this time last year at the Kincaid fire in Sonoma County, and I've been to California quite a few times over the years, worked with fire agencies over there. I think that was a trigger for a lot of traumatised people in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia in particular. COVID is another tragedy on top of a tragedy. So my heart goes out to everybody who's lost loved ones through the fires, through COVID. But a glimmer of hope, I have to say, I give the government a big tick for state and territory governments and the federal government, because with COVID, they listened to experts, they listened to scientists, they acted decisively and quickly in the best interests of the population. So now that they've proven they can do that, we need to push them to do it with the existential threat of climate change. And when you talk about human rights, I feel that I have a duty. I've copped a lot of flack by speaking out. It's not usual for former senior bureaucrats and public servants to speak out as much as my former fire chief and emergency service chief colleagues have. And we've copped a bit of flack. But I have a duty to my grandkids and their generation to do everything I possibly can to save them from a worse fate than we've just been through, because it is going to get worse. It's locked in from the carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane that's already been emitted and is building up as we speak. It's going to get hotter, it's going to get warmer. So we have to plateau off and drive it down at some stage.
Do you think it seems like the next season, the fire season, is not going to be as bad? It's obviously not coming off quite as chaotic to circumstances as last year. It seems that it's going to be slightly more of perhaps rain, for instance, and flooding next season. Do you think that's going to make people think, oh, that was just a blip, that one incident? Or do you think people understand now that ongoing relationship between the climate change and the effect on, fires, for instance, going to the future?
Look, Craig, I'm going to congratulate you here, because people like you are keeping it in front of the public eye, and that's very, very important that we keep telling people how bad it was, because they just sort of move on. Actually, I'm really worried about this coming disaster season. I've been out doing a lot of hazard reduction burns, and sorry, Zali, when you get back from Canberra, North Head's burnt out because we lost a big burn there on the weekend. We're losing all the burns because it's much drier in Sydney than it was this time last year. But I think the rains are coming. La Nina, the last big La Nina ended the millennium drought in 2011. We had New South Wales firefighters, dozens of them in Queensland, searching for bodies in the Lockyer Valley, hosing mud out of homes in Brisbane, helping look for possibly deceased persons after Cyclone Yessie. So everything's extreme under climate change and is getting worse. So look, hold on to your seat, because it could be quite a different disaster season.
Yeah, that's the thing, is we may not get the fire season, but we get hit in so many different ways in Australia. We're so vulnerable in so many ways, although not as vulnerable as some nations, which takes us to our next guest. Just a reminder as well, if you do want to put questions, put them into the chat box, and we'll try to get to those with our wonderful panel later on. Our next guest, Yessie Mosby, you're a traditional owner of a massive island in the Torres Strait. You moved back to the island 10 years ago and have been witnessing many changes in the climate since. I know when I say that Australia is impacted by climate change, I would say you would say, well, hold my beer, it gets a lot worse here. Tell us about what you've seen there.
Well, thank you, Craig. I would like to give the acknowledgement for the traditional owners, past, present, and emerging on the country where I'm situated and throughout Australia. And for the loved ones who passed on, may they rest in peace. I've been living here in the Torres Strait all my life. I lived on the western side of the Torres Strait, and I moved back and forth to my traditional homeland where I'm situated now today is on Masig. I moved here in 2009, and what I've seen within this period of this 10 years of me staying here, it's a very emotional, scary feeling. It affects not only me, but the community mentally, physically, and spiritually as well. Saying spiritually, my wife generation side of the family lost their loved ones to the sea. The remains of their ancestor got washed out by the erosion what we had was faced. I lost some of my grandmother's remains due to the first inundation, which revealed her remains. Then the second inundation came and took her away. The fearful part in living here as well is because we live on a coral cay island in the central part of the Torres Strait. Our island is, all the islands around our islands is one of the major islands for the bird economy, which the bird, how they navigate out, how they fly from Australia to mainland Papua New Guinea. And to see most of the different type of seabirds we don't see here anymore, it saddens us because we never seen them ever since from last 5 years ago. The water capacity, the well water we drink is all brackish. We don't drink it anymore. It spoils the crops of our gardens. We don't use our water now to drink, nor to wet our gardens. It's just there and collecting mosquitoes and stuff like that. Living here on York Island, Masig, the weather is unpredictable. We cannot read and study the weather patterns anymore. We have longer droughts and we have stronger monsoons, which drowns our crops. The life living here is sad because it breaks our connection from our land where we live on. Losing our land, as we see last year, April month, we've lost 3 meters in that day. Within 5 hours, we lost 3 meters. And that 3 meters, when I was young, I'm only 37 years old. When I was young, 3 meters was taken like within 5 years. But this 3 meter was taken all in one day. This year, the southeast wind blows on this side of the village where I am situated. It's still been blowing now for the past 9 months. And it took out all of another 4 meters away from the coastline on the side where I live. It's sad. It's frightening. We don't know when it's going to stop.
Yeah, yes, so that's extraordinary to hear the extent of the effects that you're feeling there. And I guess the question about when it's going to stop goes to my next question, which is that you and 7 other Torres Strait Islanders have taken Australia to the Human Rights Council about their inaction on climate change. What made you decide to take this step, and what are you hoping to achieve in this?
Why we took this step further is because of our future. When we had the scientists come out to Masig, to York Island, and they've studied the erosion patterns of the island, and they said within the next 30 to 50 years, we will have to be removed and moved to mainland Australia. Our fear was that we didn't want to be refugees in our own country, and the fear of losing our identity of one's true culture. And for our family remains who are buried here, we just don't want to leave our genealogy behind, our family tree behind, our lines. More for the fact that our elders who are present now, alive today, don't want to, take that move. So we took it on our shoulders and said, like, this is something that we have to do now to preserve whatever we have for our future, so our future generation would have a freeable life to live, to practice their culture and their tradition on their own land. We've been here for over 60,000 years, and we won't leave in the next 30 years, regardless. We know that there's a light behind this tunnel where we're now. We know that there is a light, and we hope that we'll get to that light sooner or later, because we know that something could be done.
Yes, so have you had any response from the Australian government? Is there any sense that they are concerned about this or listening to your challenge?
We did got a response, and the response was from the government that we want you to drop your case, that this case should not be going ahead. Australia is not the only country which is contributing to the fossil fuels and stuff. It's the whole world to be blamed, and therefore the 8 claimants of Torres Strait has to drop the case.
Yes, that's a very similar argument that the government uses in domestic politics as well about their footprint. They say, well, we're only a small part of it, we don't do much. And I think it's one of the difficult things to convince the Australian public that may not be the case, that we're one of the biggest polluters when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions, particularly per person in the world. So, look, we'll be watching with fascination your case. We've got a question from the audience, and I'll put this to everyone here. Where are the pressure points for influence or change? We have, interestingly, a few different approaches here. We've got Yessie's legal approach, and that's something that's coming to the fore a lot more recently. We've got Zali with the legislative challenge, and I guess Greg has been doing a lot of campaigning and putting a lot of pressure on the public level. Where do you think are the most effective pressure points to change this debate? I'll come to you first, Zali.
Well, I think it's probably all of those points. I think we have to link it into how much the outcome will impact everyone. So I think the legal challenge is important, because there is a duty of care to our Australian community, but our neighbours as well, of the impact. And that's been widely acknowledged in other aspects, and so should be as well when it comes to climate. I think we all have power as consumers. And we're seeing a rise in class actions or consumer action when it comes to shareholders, being wise to where do we put our money, where do you invest, where does your super invest your money? These are all really, it's very influential. At the end of the day, fossil fuel projects only get up because someone's financing them. So if the finance dries up, there is a real question as to their future. And then obviously there has to be accountability at political level, and that is, also, you can't just accept sort of, an MP, whether it be local government, state government or federal government, that kind of, says all the right things, greenwashes their position to the community, but then doesn't deliver results. So you have to hold them accountable. You actually have to ask for, results, and votes should match. So I think the pressure points are all around, but as Greg said, Craig, the education piece is really important. The fact that this is not an issue that's going away, it needs to become so insurmountable that it just has to be addressed, even from the most reluctant government corners.
Exactly. Greg, I'll come to you to follow up that point. What do you think are the main pressure points for influence or change?
Look, similar to Zali, I think all at once, and I'll take a firefighting analogy. If you've got a raging bushfire coming at you, you don't just go, look, we'll bring in the aircraft, or no, we won't use them, we'll just use hoses on the ground, or no, hang on, we'll just light a backburn. You do everything possible within reason. And When I say within reason, I think any protest actions or whatever, we need to make sure that we don't turn people off by going too far. We don't want to see violent protests or anything like that, because that does alienate people. But we need to get out there and demand action by every possible means. Zali talked about education. That's a big thing I've been trying to do, is educate people about the myths that were put forward by the Murdoch press, by politicians, some conservative politicians. Like it was arsonists, it was a greenie stopping back burning, sick. They don't even know the right terminology. But get out there and add your voice. Is there one particular? I don't think there's any silver bullet, but I think it's getting more and more people involved.
There's many, attacking from many fronts. Andy, what do you think? Where do you think? I might actually also open this up when I ask you this, Andy, not just where are the pressure points, but I guess where are the roadblocks as well, if that's come across in this edition of Human Rights Defender, where people seem to see where the problems are for justice.
Yeah, well, in terms of the pressure points, I agree with Zali and Greg, especially, you know, what I was saying at the beginning, what Greg said. Now we need to fight this on many fronts. In terms of my own research, for example, I look at the mining industry, human rights in the mining industry, and you can see there's a whole heap of pressure points on companies these days, on mining companies. So these can come from the local communities, and in this issue we've got Tish King from Seed Mob talking about Indigenous activism, for example, but also then further down the supply chain. So mining companies, what they're mining ends up in products that are marketed by mining companies may not be that sensitive to public opinion, but certainly some of the companies they sell their products to are. And so you've got a company like Tesla, for example, who are branding themselves as the kind of forefront of the green revolution. Well, they certainly put a lot of pressure on the mining companies they buy their products from, because they don't want any hint of non-sustainability in that supply chain. So if you look around, there's all sorts of potential levers. In terms of the roadblocks, I think there's a kind of saturation in people that we need to overcome. You look at the news and it's all, I think there's this kind of, it just appears too overwhelming. So that's why I was kind of recommending that you just focus on maybe one area that you can achieve something in, because you look at the news and it just looks impossible. I think a lot of people have got between kind of fatigue or a kind of when animals are in an impossible situation, they take on these kind of displacement activities where they do something that's totally illogical and just sort of don't react to the situation at hand. I think there's a bit of that in society at the moment, but
I think that's true. And it's interesting how you talked earlier about people feeling as if the responsibility is on their back for climate change. I don't think it's on individuals or families. I think that sometimes looking at solutions can give a bit of relief from the depression of the situation, but B, can also help to get people more engaged. And I think one of the interesting things that's hard about climate change is there's still a massive amount of misunderstanding about it. And it's one of the things that's surprising, given feel like we've been talking about it forever, but there's a lot of people that misunderstand it. I just want to come to Yessie quickly. You've gone the legal route of going to the United Nations Human Rights Council. Is that because Pacific Islands have been taking the political route and trying to talk to the Australian government and other governments for years and just hitting up against a brick wall?
Well, we understood and what our brothers and sisters have been facing in the Pacific. Is this step here? We up here is taking. We took this step not because we've seen that they were hitting brick wall, but it's because that we knew that and we felt that this could be heard.
Mm.
This could be heard.
As a Torres Strait Islander, did you consider going the domestic legal route, fighting in the Australian courts, or was there no avenue for that? And that's why you look to the Human Rights Council.
There was a lady who was here, and we've sought legal advisors in how could we go, because when we've asked the government to come up and all of that, the government refused to come and stuff like that. In all avenue, all paths, what we took, and that's when we hit the brick wall. So we said, like, now, when we were talking and seeking a little bit more, and said, now look, we want to go beyond what we're doing now, because we need our voice to be heard. Things needs to be done now for our people and for our future. That's when we went up to the UN.
Yeah.
Because everything where we did go, we were hitting brick wall from the start. So this is something now where we jump over.
Well, exactly. Well, it might set an interesting precedent as well. So I'm amazed, I think a lot of people it's brought to a lot of people's attention as well. So it's an interesting approach. A final question. I think we may have lost Zali to the bells ringing in Parliament there, but she may be back. We'll see. What is the one thing that you'd like the audience members to do today that could help make progress towards climate justice? People that are watching in now, what can they do to further the cause of climate justice? Andy, as the editor of Human Rights Defender, you've had the benefit of reading all the articles, and I'm going to give that to you first. What should they do?
Well, I think one of the articles makes an important point. Sophie Marjanac, whom I interviewed, she says that there's this kind of, this notion of individual responsibility is one that's been promoted heavily by the oil companies, for example, because it's one that suits them. And I mean, the fact is, we've all got emissions, and what Sophie said, that she feels that people are scared to raise their voice on these issues because that someone's going to point at them and say, well, you flew to Europe last week, or you drive a four-wheel drive, this and that. And so I think I'd say that the one thing I'd recommend is that you don't feel guilty about that, because it's not individuals that are causing this, really. It's not individuals that have the power to change this rapidly. It's governments and corporations. And so forget the guilt and apply yourself to looking for those levers, what you can achieve in that space.
It's interesting because in some ways, I agree the theory, although in practice in Australia, I actually disagree with that point, because one of the extraordinary things about Australia is that we are so absolutely fundamentally terrible at reducing our emissions. So we've gone up 3 years in the last 6. And in actual fact, last year, there were lots of press releases because we'd achieved a reduction. And the reduction was 5 million tonnes of CO2. Bugger all, less than 1%. For members of the public in Australia to reduce 5 million tonnes is literally a 1-week effort, to be honest, dealing with a couple of their energy or changing or offsetting some of their flights or doing things like that. So I think that it is important that people don't dismiss that, because I think that's also one of the reasons why people have been more reticent to be politically active, is they were like, well, I don't know what to do in my own life. I think it actually happens the other way, that if you get people being active in their own life, they start to say, well, if I'm doing this, why are we not getting movement from politicians? And that's a very different way in which I think power actually works in Australia. If our politicians see the public actually taking action, they're more likely to act. If they see the public saying they care about it but not doing anything themselves, I think they're more likely to say, people don't worry about this as much as they might worry about, I don't know, franking credits or some other ridiculous thing like that. So, it's an interesting, that dynamic between public action and politics, I think, is a bit more complex in actual fact. Greg, what do you think people should do to progress towards climate justice?
Just talking about the 5 million tonnes, and most of that apparently was because of the drought and a reduction in the agricultural sector. So nothing that the government did, but part of a creeping natural disaster, in fact. The big thing to me is to arm yourself with knowledge. Consume your science from universities and institutions like the Climate Council, not from Facebook. once you actually know facts, share those facts. And I'd ask people not to be what Scott Morrison wants you to be, a quiet Australian, be a very, very noisy one and say that you want action. And look, lastly, think about your kids, think about your grandkids, because that will motivate them, and it's real.
Yes, so can I ask you a question? How can people support your campaign? How can they follow it? How can they support it? I think you might be on mute, Yessie.
Sorry.
That's right.
Yeah, there is a website which is called ourislandsourhome.org. And the other one is #Torres Strait 8. You can go on Google or Instagram. It's all available on there as well. And your support will mean a lot. Thank you.
That's good. Well, good luck with it. And of course, if you want to find out any more about any of these issues, the Human Rights Defender special issue on climate justice it's out now. And can we get it? Is it officially open? Have we smashed champagne on it? Where can people get it?
Yep, it's out. It's online. There'll be a link to it at the end of the webinar, and there'll be print copies available as well. But it's already available online.
Great. If you want to get some more knowledge on any of these issues, find out about all the fascinating campaigns that are taking place to try and bring climate justice, which is, I think, at the core of a lot of this. It's interesting how often people perceive climate change as an environmental issue, and while it is to a point, it's a human issue as well. It's a humanity issue. It's an issue of justice. It's an issue of how we live in the future. And I often say you can hate trees and birds and koalas and still be very passionate about climate change, because it is an issue that affects a lot of people. So yeah, look into it. Find out more. Arm yourself with knowledge, as Greg says. And thank you for joining us here today. Congratulations on the issue. Cheers, Andy.